With TBC Anniversary just getting started, people are already asking about what comes next. That's just how things work with Classic WoW. The moment one expansion launches, everyone starts talking about what's after it. And it is a fair question, to be honest, because MMOs are supposed to go somewhere long term. They are meant to have a plan which can last for many years, and at the moment Anniversary is pointing towards a completion of the trilogy. Warcraft Classic launched back in 2022 now, which means a decent chunk of people either didn't have the chance to play it or may not fully remember that in fact this version of the game was quite different from its original release way back in the day. Some of the changes Blizzard made were good, some were less well received. So today I want to go through all the changes that Warcraft Classic had, just so you can appreciate how different it actually was. So ultimately, would Warcraft Anniversary hold up once again, or was this expansion really just not as good as people remembered it? A quick shout out to today's sponsor Boot.dev. Stay tuned because I've got an exclusive 30% discount code coming up. So Warcraft Classic launched in September of 2022 and the hype going into it was enormous. This historically was the most popular version of World of Warcraft ever, that we are aware of by the numbers at least. The game peaked somewhere around 12 million subscribers during that original Warcraft version. It's an expansion that a huge portion of the WoW community thinks of when they picture the best version of the game, and for a good reason. So many people came back specifically to play this game once again, because Warcraft was when WoW became the most accessible and new to them. It was when the story reached its most cinematic heights, and when Northrend gave us some of the most memorable zones. There were of course some logging queue issues when Warcraft Classic first dropped, though this wasn't to be necessarily unexpected. In fact, it had just become part of the new WoW expansion experience by this point in time, though one of the most controversial changes Blizzard made actually was not during the duration of Warcraft Classic. It happened right when they announced it at BlizzCon, and that was removing the Dungeon Finder. LFD was added into Warcraft originally right towards the end of the expansion in patch 3.3, which would be the Ice Crown patch. This let players queue cross-server for dungeons automatically, and I remember Blizzard announcing the removal of the looking for dungeon system, and they did it instantaneously alongside the announcement for Warcraft because they were 100% certain that it was going to be unanimously well received and people would be cheering for this change. After all, historically, if you go back to the start of Classic in 2019 and before that, people were telling Blizzard for years and years that Dungeon Finder was one of the worst things ever, and it was one of the reasons WoW had gone downhill. So Blizzard had a chance to correct history, they acted on it, they did it, and a lot of people hated it. So many people who were coming back to Warcraft said, well, I've been waiting for the LFD system now. I did actually find it annoying during Vanilla and TBC to have to spam a chat channel and try and form a group that way. However, Blizzard would hold strong on there not being an LFD. Maybe they just haven't put work into restoring it, or maybe they were just testing the waters. However, this system would end up being reintroduced to the game during the Ice Crown patch. So in some ways we did get the full Warcraft Classic experience, in that the looking for dungeon system was reintroduced when it should have originally been introduced. That being said, I think this was a bit of a surprising moment for Blizzard and the wider community, that a lot of people had been waiting for this feature, and the LFD controversy, as it turned out, will be the first of many changes in Warcraft Classic. Before we go on, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. If you've ever wondered what goes on behind the scenes in creating the games you play, Boot.dev is the perfect place to learn more. Starting as a Python beginner, you'll work your way to expert through a hands-on engaging RPG-like experience. As you progress through the lessons, you'll earn items and power-ups that actually help you solve difficult situations. Complete quests, get rewards, just like in WoW, except these items, for example, let you feed Boots the AI helper or view solutions without XP penalties. Speaking of Boots, he's your personal AI tutor trained on every lesson with full context of what you're learning. And when you're stuck, he won't outright hand you the answers. Instead, he'll ask follow-up questions to nudge you back on track so you understand what you're learning properly. There's even a Discord community that gives Boot a bit of that guild feeling as well. It's genuinely active with real people helping each other out, and it is always more motivating to feel as though your progression is part of something bigger rather than you just grinding away solo. And it's also risk-free because you can refund within 30 days if you want to. So really, there's no better time to start than today. So click the link in the description and use use my code Willie to get 30% off your entire first year for Boot.dev. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the sponsor today. Let's get on back to WoW. Another thing which was equally controversial and came out of nowhere was the introduction of the WoW token during the trial of the Grand Crusader patch. Blizzard had not mentioned this in advance whatsoever, and it just came completely out of the blue alongside the patch. This WoW token would work much in the same way that it always has, except it wasn't exchangeable for Battle.net balance, and to this day I believe the Classic token isn't exchangeable for balance. Originally, when they first put the WoW token in the game, they made it exchangeable during Legion, so only a few years later. At this point in time though, I'm not entirely sure that they're ever going to do it. Maybe they're worried about too many people having too much gold and just filling up on Battle.net balance and getting too much stuff for free. By this point in time then, when the WoW token was introduced, the landscape of the game had changed significantly. GDKP, which is just bidding for items with gold within a raid, had started to really become mainstream, and so many guilds and raiders were looking to this instead of raiding with their own guild. And with TBC Anniversary at the moment, I'm going to admit I am a bit surprised that the WoW token is not in the game yet, because they've offered a boost which gets you straight up to 58 with your gear, your weapon skill and so on, but then you come to realize that TBC is very front loaded in terms of content and how much gold you really need to get up to speed. All I can say though is if Wrath Anniversary ever ends up happening, it's absolutely going to have the token, and if the WoW token is brought into TBC Anniversary in advance of an announcement for Wrath Anniversary, to me that's a big green flag saying Wrath is going to happen. One way or another, for better or for worse though, the WoW token was introduced during Wrath Classic. On top of that, one of the areas of the game which saw the most changes by far were the raids. So phase 1 was revamped Naxxramas, Obsidian Sanctum and the Eye of Eternity, and all the content here was buffed by roughly 30% compared to original Wrath. It's easy to forget this because if you did the content you'll think wow, it was completely face roll, and yes it was, which puts in perspective how unbelievably face roll it would have been back in the day. Essentially, Blizzard brought back Naxxramas because no one really did it during vanilla. It was estimated well under 1% of the player base even saw inside of that raid, so it was an easy win for them to bring it back, especially alongside a Scourge and Undead themed expansion. But in Classic, so many of us did do Naxxramas and we've been raiding it weekly, so to just see a watered down version of it was frankly kind of boring. At least Obsidian Sanctum with the 3 Drake strats was fairly interesting, but overall phase 1 was being carried by the class changes more so than the actual content itself. But then in the horizon we had Ulduar coming, and Ulduar is of course one of Blizzard's crowning jewels, one of their testaments to how good raiding can be in this game. Ulduar was gonna save the day, right? Before getting into the raid, it is worth explaining something about Ulduar, because in advance of Wrath Classic, Blizzard were planning to do everything post-nerf. Now they had done TBC Classic pre-nerf, and especially on tier 5 that was really difficult. I think in response to this they wanted to dial things back and make Wrath a bit easier since the content was already taking a step up comparatively. Of course you've already seen on TBC Anniversary they backtracked on that. Either way, they did some digging and found out that actually Ulduar underwent a ton of nerfs back in the day, and so Blizzard committed to doing a pre-nerf difficulty for this legendary raid, and what we ended up getting was the hardest Classic raid we had seen so far by an absolute mile. There are plenty of very challenging bosses such as Hard Mode Mimron, Hard Mode Iron Council, Yogg Zero, or Algalon, and there was even a boss which was actually impossible on a hard mode and is the only boss ever to be unkilled in Classic in its pre-nerf difficulty, and that is XT002, which is the second hard mode of the instance and absolutely gatekeeps the rest of the instance. The numbers were just beyond what any guild could possibly do, even with a perfect raid comp and excellent RNG. To put it in perspective, they lowered his hard mode health from 47.5 million down to 25,200,000. That's how much they nerf him. After the nerf he was pretty easy, one of the easier hard modes, but pre-nerf just wasn't possible at our current gear levels. Another thing Blizzard did in Ulduar was they buffed the item levels of gear across the board, especially from hard mode. Now the reason they did this is they looked at how gearing went back in the day, and when Trial of the Crusader came out, the gear from that was A, an upgrade, and B, it was just significantly easier. So Blizzard wanted Ulduar content to last a bit longer, therefore they buffed the item levels of gear in there. This also made there be some BIS items that came from 10 man or 25 hard mode, because because bosses had different loot tables between the two difficulties, which there were some upsides and downsides too. If you really loved Ulduar, you absolutely had reasons to do 10 and 25 every week. If you were getting a bit tired of it and you were still trying to farm that one guy's Mjolnir runestone from that one boss, you know what I'm talking about if you did Ulduar, then it started to get kind of old really quickly. However, Blizzard did come up with another solution for this loot split later on, which we'll get onto in a moment. I remember when I did my retrospective video on Wrath that a big thing I brought up was the hard mode loot system itself, and I'm going to echo what I said in that video. It is one of the worst loot systems I've ever seen in this game. When you kill a hard mode boss, you get one extra item from that particular boss, and sometimes they just never drop the item you need, which after a while made it start to feel super frustrating to farm this raid, because you just never get Flare of the Heavens, for example. Also, remember, Blizzard had buffed the item levels of everything, apart from tier gear. Now, the Ulduar tier in some cases is some of the best looking tier in the game, and it just wasn't really used that much because the item level of other gear was so much higher. I think with hard mode, if all the bosses dropped a token which could be used on the tier gear to upgrade it to hard mode equivalent item level, the loot from the raid would feel so much more rewarding. Yes, it would make the raid easier overall because you're getting more gear, but there was enough of a difficulty curve in this raid already, because as Ulduar started to go through the motions, the raiding player base started to drop off, and really quickly. Did you know it was around Ulduar and Wrath Classic when Classic Era started getting more popular, and when people started to play hardcore mode more? Tier 5 in TBC might have been on the edge of being too difficult, but that difficulty was centered around the final boss of each raid. In Ulduar, if it was hard mode, it just tended to be pretty difficult in general. And then of course there was fights such as Yogg Zero, which without stacking Affliction Warlocks, you just really couldn't beat it for the first few weeks. Or how about Algalon, where you had 1 hour per reset to defeat him before he just despawned, and that was it, your chance was gone. And Ulduar went on for months and months. Blizzard wanted to give it time to breathe, perhaps they gave it a little bit too much. Either way, there were absolutely good and bad things about this legendary raid tier. What I will say for sure is the progression on it was some of the most fun I've had during Classic. Then eventually, of course, Trial of the Crusader came around, and honestly it went a lot better than its reputation would suggest. After weeks of demanding progression for Ulduar, a short and quick clear through a relatively easy raid felt as though it was welcome. Blizzard also did another change here, because this was the first raid ever where heroic mode was introduced into the game, and back in the day you could run normal 10, normal 25, heroic 10 and heroic 25 every single week. So Blizzard made same raid sizes share a lockout, so you could only do it maximum 2 times per week instead of up to 4. They were basically worried people were going to burn themselves out by doing this raid on all the difficulties to min-max their loot acquisition, which people absolutely would have done, so I think this was the right call from Blizzard here. Sometimes you gotta protect the players from themselves. And then finally, of course, we have Icecrown Citadel. This one also came pre-nerf, and there were plenty of challenging fights as well, such as Syndragosa, Professor Putricide, and of course the Lich King. To this day in WoW Classic, across all the expansions, Week 1 Lich King was the hardest boss we've ever seen. Blizzard also did some changes to Shadowmourne, so normally you have to advance the Shadowmourne quest relatively far before you can start acquiring Shadowfrost shards from bosses. These shards are the big bottleneck, which will take you weeks and weeks to farm. However, you just got them from bosses straight away, which speeded up the acquisition of Shadowmourne significantly. Whereas back in the day you'd have a few Shadowmournes in Wrath Classic, you could have half a dozen or more if you kept clearing. One annoyance I did have with Shadowmourne was the infusion part of the quest chain, where you had to do something different on individual bosses. At first it was kind of novel to see, but then you just have to wait for someone to do something, and it got kind of old kind of fast. This is why in Cataclysm, for example, when you're doing legendary weapon stuff, most of the things you're doing are not actively during boss fights, they're after the boss fights. I don't know if Blizzard could change the infusion system, but honestly it really wasn't that great. And in ICC as well, there was also a buff which happened back in the day, which gradually increased players' power and served as kind of the nerf to the raid. Overall for Wrath raiding, Tier 7, I guess, did its job. The 30% buff was probably enough to make it feel somewhat stimulating, but it wasn't really that great. Ulduar had big positives and negatives, and the biggest negative for me was the loot system and for how long it went on for. Still, it was very fun to progress through. Trial of the Crusader was surprisingly good, and really not as bad of a raid as people made it out to be. And ICC was fun too, but I'd rather the Infusion quest just didn't exist. It wasn't just raiding that had changes either. Blizzard wanted to keep dungeon content more relevant throughout the duration of Wrath, because back in the day, and well, this was a problem Blizzard had for years with 5-player content. It's great at the start of the expansion and for leveling, but it becomes dead super quickly. So what they did in Wrath Classic was the introduction of Titan Rune dungeons. So at the start of a dungeon there would be some kind of ritual object you would interact with, and it would basically upscale the dungeons, making the mobs inside do more damage, have more health, and have some kind of new ability which fit in theme with the dungeon. This wasn't like Mythic Plus with a rotating set of affixes and dungeon difficulty that keeps going up and up. It was just a new difficulty with slightly different mechanics. From doing these Titan Rune dungeons, you got a bunch of different new currencies, and these new currencies were used to buy items from the old raid tier. So suddenly you could go farm 5-player content and then go buy your Mjolnir Runestone or Flare of the Heavens, instead of having to complete Ulduar still when Trial of the Crusader is out. And then Blizzard continued this system on when ICC came out for Trial of the Crusader loot too. Overall, I think the majority of people enjoyed this system. The positives were, well, you got to do something outside of raiding. Wrath was very centered around raiding content, I will tell you that much, and you could work towards getting loot from old raids that you would guarantee you get. Titan Rune dungeons wouldn't really make sense in tier 7 because, well, you don't have any tier to look back to get loot from, but I'm sure they would be a feature in Wrath Anniversary if it happened again, and I think they were a good feature. Aside from that, we had a number of class changes too. Blizzard did the most class changes during Wrath Classic. I think the community would have lost their mind if Blizzard tried to touch things during Vanilla or TBC, but by Wrath things were just different, and so Blizzard began to change things. The first class and spec to see any change was the Unholy Death Knight. Death Knights, of course, are the new class for Wrath of the Lich King, and people remembered them being way overpowered back in the day, but surely on a re-release on their final patch balancing, they wouldn't be so overpowered, right? Well, turns out we were in fact wrong about that. Unholy Death Knights were incredibly overpowered at the start of Wrath. What Unholy DKs were doing is stacking every single haste buff possible in the game, and then using their capstone talent, Summon Gargoyle, and this Gargoyle would do a significant amount of their damage. And during Wrath Classic, Blizzard also made all cooldowns reset after a boss encounter ended, so Unholy DKs had their full burst toolkit on every single fight. And of course bosses in tier 7 just kind of fell over anyway, so the higher uptime you have on your burst, the more damage you're gonna do. The end result was Unholy DK was the best damage dealer in the game on single target, and it just was not close. So what Blizzard did is nerf the haste scaling for Unholy DKs so they couldn't be quite as far ahead, though they did remain very good. The next class worth talking about is the Feral Druid, and they had one big change where Fairy Fire would guaranteed proc Omen of Clarity, allowing their next ability to be free. Now, there are a number of reasons Blizzard did this. One of the largest reasons was because people were doing something called bear weaving. This is when they'd used all their energy in cat form and their dots were up, they'd hop into bear form, put up some lacerate, stack some press mangle, then go back into cat again. This of course was not really the intended way to play cat, but was a DPS game. However, Fairy Fire giving you a guaranteed Omen of Clarity was a pretty substantial buff for already one of the stronger DPS classes. Blizzard nearly dialed back this buff during the ICC patch and took it away from Feral Druids, but they were somehow convinced otherwise, and so Feral Cats ended up being one of the best DPS in the game. They were already supposed to be good, by the way, but this was just a straight up buff to stop people doing bear weaving. Retribution Paladins also saw some changes. This was another one where how people remembered Rets playing did not line up with how they were playing during Wrath Classic. So in Wrath originally, Ret Palas were incredibly overpowered at launch. They were only behind DKs as the most OP class in the game. However, during Wrath Classic, we are in final patch balancing, so this made Retribution Paladins comparatively early on super weak. They were balanced around things such as having their tier 10 2-set. This gave your melee attacks a 40% chance to reset the cooldown on Divine Storm, as well as of course Shadowmourne to a lesser extent. And when Ret Pallies didn't have these things, they were kind of just bad, like really not very good at all. So Blizzard gave them a new glyph where Hand of Reckoning would do some damage which they could just macro into another ability, and made it so their seal stacks applied easier to targets on AoE and single target. These ended up being some minor buffs which helped Rets out a bit in Ulduar. However, as Rets started scaling into Trail of the Crusader and ICC, they really began to power up, and by the end of the expansion they were one of the best DPS in the game. But although they got a buff, just know that Rets still isn't very good until Trail of the Crusader and beyond. The final major class change came in ICC, and that was for Hunters. They got Trap Launcher specifically for Explosive Trap. Now Trap Launcher is a Cataclysm ability, and it cost you a bit of focus and allowed you to shoot any trap off at range. However, for Wrath, this allowed Hunters to set up traps in advance of the bosses being pulled, and made it so they didn't have to trap weave anymore. The reason Hunters were doing this is because Black Arrow, their capstone talent, and Explosive Trap shared a cooldown. An Explosive Trap would deal a lot more damage even on single target than Black Arrow for some reason, and it had a much higher chance to proc lock and load because it ticked way more often. This made it worthwhile to run underneath bosses, drop an Explosive Trap, and then disengage back out. The problem was some of these hitboxes on bosses were so bad, and sometimes going into melee range was kind of griefing your raid. So Trap Launcher was brought in to combat this, and I've said this before, if Trap Launcher was in the game from day one, Hunters would be one of the top 3 DPS for the majority of the expansion, right up until the end. The difference this made to their gameplay was significant. Alternatively, Blizzard could have just buffed Black Arrow so it did damage, had the same duration as cooldown, and ticked way more often. But either way, Trap Launcher is a very welcome change. And those are the majority of the changes, so as you can see, quite a few things are different about this game now. If we had Wrath again, I'm sure there would be WoW Token from day one, Dungeon Finder from day one, there would be those various class changes which Hunter would benefit from by far the most, and there would be differences in the raids and the Titan Rune dungeons. So after hearing all that and having a refresher on it, the big question remains, would you play Wrath Anniversary if it did indeed come after TBC? Whether or not this actually happens is very much an open-ended question, and one which I'm expecting to receive an answer to at BlizzCon 2026 in September. Another thing is that I will say I'm expecting a Classic Plus announcement then too, and a potential overlap between Classic Plus and Wrath Anniversary is, in my opinion, a problem. I don't think it benefits anyone to make players choose between a brand new game or going back to experience one they know they already like. But I think regardless of that situation, what I want to hear about is whether really you would play Wrath Anniversary again. Did you think it met expectations? Was it as good as it was hyped up to be? And ultimately, should we have a run back into Northrend once again? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.